Schoolteacher took in a stray boy until she saw the Outlaw brand on his arm. She found him collapsed behind her schoolhouse, bones sharp as winter through torn cloth. And when she lifted his face, she saw her dead son's eyes staring back at her. The autumn wind carried more than dust through Cedar Ridge that October evening. It carried the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, the promise of hard months ahead, and something else, something that made Sarah Mitchell pause at her schoolhouse door with her hand trembling on the brass knob. She had been a schoolteacher for 15 years, long enough to know the difference between a cat yowling in the alley and a child's whimper, long enough to recognize the sound of pain when it tried to hide itself in silence. Sarah set down her leather satchel and walked around the small wooden building, her boots crunching on leaves that had already surrendered to the season. Behind the schoolhouse, near the wood pile she'd been meaning to cover before the snows came, she found him. The boy lay curled against the building's weathered planks like a discarded coat, his knees drawn to his chest, his breathing shallow as a sparrow's. His clothes, if they could still be called clothes, hung in tatters around a frame, so thin she could count his ribs through the gaps in his shirt. Dirt caked his face and hands, but beneath the grime, she could see skin pale as birch bark, stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too prominent for a child. Sarah knelt beside him, her skirts pooling in the dust. Up close, she could see the fever flush on his cheeks, the way his eyelids fluttered with dreams or delirium. When she touched his forehead with the back of her hand, his skin burned hot as a stone left too long in summer sun. "Child," she whispered, and at the sound of her voice, his eyes opened. They were blue as winter sky, those eyes, and they held a depth of weariness that made Sarah's heart clench like a fist. She had seen that look before, in her mirror, on the morning they told her that her own boy wouldn't be coming home from the fever ward. It was the look of someone who had learned too young that the world could take everything you loved and leave you empty as a broken well. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice cracked as drought-hardened earth. "I wasn't stealing nothing. I was just so cold." Sarah looked at him, really looked, and saw herself 5 years ago, kneeling beside a different bed, watching fever steal the light from another child's eyes. She saw every mother who had ever held a hungry child, every woman who had ever whispered prayers to an empty sky. "Hush now," she said, slipping her arms beneath his shoulders. "Nobody's accusing you of anything." He was light as autumn leaves, this boy, all hollow bones and hope worn thin. As she lifted him, he made a sound, half sob, half sigh, and let his head fall against her shoulder. The gesture was so trusting, so completely surrendered, that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. She carried him through the schoolhouse and into the small room she called home, past the desk where she graded arithmetic papers by lamplight, past the bookshelf that held her husband's Bible and her son's toy soldiers. In her kitchen, she settled the boy into the chair by the stove and lit the lamp with hands that shook only slightly. In the amber glow, she could see him more clearly. 12, perhaps 13 years old, with hair the color of wheat before harvest, and a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so gaunt with hunger. His eyes followed her every movement as she moved around the kitchen, wary as a wild animal's, but grateful too. "What's your name, child?" she asked, setting water to boil on the stove. He was quiet for so long she thought he might have drifted back into fever dreams. Then, so softly she almost missed it, "Jack." "Jack what?" Another silence, longer this time. "Just Jack, ma'am." Sarah nodded. She understood about names that carried too much weight, about pasts better left buried in the dust of yesterday's mistakes. She cut thick slices of bread from the loaf she'd baked that morning, spread them with butter and honey, and set them before him with a glass of milk still warm from her neighbor's cow. Jack stared at the food as if it might vanish if he looked away. Then he picked up a slice of bread with hands that trembled, brought it to his mouth, and took a bite. The sound he made, part moan, part prayer, told Sarah everything she needed to know about how long it had been since he'd eaten. She turned away to give him privacy for his hunger, busying herself with meaningless tasks while he ate. When she looked back, Tears were streaming down his face, mixing with the crumbs on his chin, and he was still chewing, still swallowing, as if each bite were a small miracle. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched this broken boy eat her bread, and wondered if God had a sense of humor, or if maybe, just maybe, he had a sense of justice after all. That night, as Jack slept on the small cot she'd made up in the spare room, Sarah sat by her kitchen window and watched the stars wheel overhead. She thought about hunger, not just of the body, but of the soul, and wondered what kind of story this boy carried in his bones. Tomorrow would bring questions, she knew. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, her house didn't feel quite so empty, and that was enough to let her believe in mercy again. For 3 weeks, she loved him like her own, until the fever broke and she saw what they'd burned in his flesh, a brand that could get them both killed. 3 weeks passed like seasons in miniature, each day bringing small changes that Sarah cataloged in her heart like a miser counting coins. Jack's cheeks filled out first, then his arms lost their sharp angles, and finally the hollow look began to fade from those winter sky eyes. But some things remained constant. The way he startled at sudden sounds, how he always sat facing the door, the careful distance he maintained even in kindness. Sarah learned to read his silences. The tight quiet when she asked about his family meant pain too deep for words. The thoughtful pause before he answered simple questions meant he was weighing truth against safety. The soft breathing when he thought she wasn't looking meant he was allowing himself, for just a moment, to believe he might be safe. In her classroom, he became a ghost in the back corner, watching her teach the town children with eyes that absorbed everything but revealed nothing. He never raised his hand, never volunteered an answer, but she caught him mouthing along with the arithmetic lessons, saw his lips move silently during reading time. Intelligence lived behind those careful eyes, sharp and bright as creek water over stones. The other children whispered, of course. Children always did. But Sarah silenced speculation with a look that had cowed generations of Cedar Ridge youth, and after a few days, they accepted Jack's presence the way prairie accepts wind, as something that simply was. At home, he helped with chores like a boy raised to useful work. He could split kindling with an axe too big for his hands, could mend a fence rail with nothing but wire and determination. His movements carried an economy that spoke of hard lessons learned early. No wasted motion, no complaints, no requests for easier tasks. Sarah watched him work and wondered what kind of life had taught a child to be so careful, so grateful for simple things. When she handed him a plate of eggs and bacon, he looked at her like she'd offered him gold. When she told him he could sleep late on Sundays, his eyes went wide, as if the concept of rest were foreign as speaking French. "Where did you come from, Jack?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire, she with her mending and he with one of her late husband's books. He looked up from the pages, Pilgrim's Progress, she noted, and wondered if he understood the irony. "Nowhere particular, ma'am. Just around. Family." The book closed with a soft thud. "No, ma'am. Not anymore." She wanted to press, but something in his voice warned her away. Instead, she watched him trace patterns on the book's worn cover and thought about all the stories that lived in silence, all the histories too painful to speak aloud. It was fever that betrayed him. The sickness came swift and hard, the way autumn fevers did on the frontier. One day, he was helping her grade papers. The next, he was burning up like prairie grass in drought. Sarah sat beside his bed through 2 nights, sponging his face with cool water and whispering prayers she'd forgotten she remembered. On the 3rd morning, his fever broke like a summer storm passing, leaving him weak but clear-eyed. Sarah helped him sit up to drink some broth, and when he swayed with exhaustion, she steadied him with gentle hands. "Easy now," she murmured, reaching to help him out of the sweat-soaked shirt. "Let's get you cleaned up." That's when she saw it. The brand on his left forearm stood out like a curse against pale skin. The letter D burned deep into young flesh with deliberate precision. The scar tissue was old but not ancient, maybe 2 years healed, raised and angry, looking, even the morning light filtering through her bedroom window. Sarah's hands froze. The washcloth fell to the floor with a wet slap that seemed loud as gunfire in the sudden silence. Dalton Gong. Every person west of the Mississippi knew that mark. Frank and Grat Dalton had branded their territory and their people the way ranchers mark cattle. Anyone carrying that letter was property of the most notorious outlaw family in 3 territories. They robbed banks like other men picked apples, casually, frequently, and without apparent conscience. They'd killed marshals, burned homesteads, and left widows in their wake from Kansas to the Oklahoma Territory. And this boy, this gentle child who read to her in the evenings and helped old Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries, wore their mark burned into his flesh. Jack saw her expression, and his face went white as winter snow. He jerked the shirt from her hands and clutched it to his chest, covering the brand, but it was too late. The damage was done, the secret exposed like a wound scraped raw. "Ma'am, I can explain," he started, but his voice cracked on the words. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing between the boy she'd grown to love and the implications of that crude letter. The Daltons were killers. They used children as lookouts, as bait, as expendable tools in their bloody trade. The wanted posters in Marshal Brady's office carried drawings of this very brand, warnings about Dalton associates who might seem harmless. "Please," Jack whispered, and there were tears in his eyes now. "Please don't send me away. I ain't. I'm not like them. I swear I'm not." But Sarah couldn't speak. She could only stare at the brand hidden beneath thin cotton and wonder how many lies she'd swallowed along with his gratitude. How many deaths might be traced to those small, careful hands? How many crimes hid behind those winter blue eyes? The boy she'd been learning to love sat before her, shaking with more than fever, and Sarah felt the solid ground of her new happiness shifting like sand beneath her feet. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, each flake a question mark against her window glass. Sarah sat in the growing silence and realized that love and trust were different countries entirely, and she was about to discover which one she'd been living in all along. When a marshal knocked on her door asking about the Dalton boy, Sarah had 3 seconds to choose between the law and love, and her answer would damn them both. The brand changed everything and nothing. Sarah still served Jack breakfast each morning, still listened to him read aloud in the evenings, still watched him help Mrs. Patterson with her groceries. But now every gesture carried weight, every kindness felt deliberate, and every silence stretched like a rope ready to snap. She found herself studying his hands as he buttered his bread, wondering what those fingers had done before they'd learned to turn pages gently. When he laughed at something in his book, she searched his face for signs of deception, for cracks in the mask of innocence he wore so well. The boy who had seemed transparent as creek water now felt deep as a canyon, full of shadows she couldn't fathom. But doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford, because doubt made her careless. And carelessness, in a town like Cedar Ridge, could get you killed. 3 days after the fever broke, Marshal Tom Brady rode into town. Sarah knew him by reputation, a man who wore his badge like armor and his righteousness like Sunday clothes. He'd been tracking outlaws across the territories for 15 years, had put more criminals in pine boxes than jail cells, and had never been known to bend a law, not even to save his own mother's soul. She watched from her classroom window as he dismounted outside Peterson's store, his spurs catching the afternoon light like threats. Even from a distance, she could see the hard set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested casual but ready on his gun. He wasn't here for supplies or pleasantries. That evening, as Sarah tried to focus on lesson plans and Jack worked quietly on arithmetic problems, 3 sharp knocks rattled her door. The sound cut through the domestic peace like an axe through kindling, and she saw Jack's pencil freeze mid-calculation. "Stay here," she whispered, but Jack was already moving, slipping from his chair like smoke, positioning himself where he could see the door but remain hidden. The motion was too smooth, too practiced, and Sarah felt her heart sink another degree. She opened the door to find Marshal Brady filling her doorframe, his hat in his hands, but his eyes hard as winter iron. Up close, she could see the dust of hard miles on his coat, the fatigue that came from chasing ghosts across empty prairie. "Evening, Miss Mitchell. Sorry to trouble you so late." His voice was polite, but carried an edge that made her skin prickle. "Marshall Brady, what brings you to Cedar Ridge?" He glanced past her into the warm glow of her kitchen, and she fought the urge to step sideways to block his view. "I'm tracking a boy. Dalton associate. Went missing about a month ago from a hideout up in the Nations. 12, maybe 13 years old, light hair, branded on the left arm." Sarah's mouth went dry as desert dust. "I see. Thing is, these Dalton boys, they're not just lookouts. This particular child was present at the Coffeyville bank job, the one where 2 citizens died. Makes him an accessory to murder in the eyes of the law." Brady's gaze never left her face. "You wouldn't happen to have seen anyone matching that description, would you?" Behind her, Sarah heard the soft creak of floorboards. Jack, moving closer to listen or moving to run. She couldn't tell which. The weight of his presence pressed against her back like a physical thing, and she thought about the boy who read Pilgrim's Progress by firelight, who thanked her for every meal as if each one were a miracle. "No," she said, the lies sliding off her tongue smooth as butter. "No, I haven't seen anyone like that." Marshall Brady studied her face with eyes that had learned to read guilt in the set of a mouth, truth in the flutter of an eyelash. Sarah kept her expression neutral, called upon 15 years of facing down unruly students and demanding parents. She thought about her son, buried in the cemetery behind the church, and about the boy hiding in her kitchen who had never asked for anything but kindness. "You sure about that, Miss Mitchell?" "Because I've got reports of a young stranger seen around town. Someone matching the description. Children pass through all the time, Marshall. Traveling with families, looking for work. I couldn't say if any of them had brands or not. I don't make a habit of examining children's arms." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Brady put his hat back on, adjusting the brim with deliberate care. "Well, if you do see anything, you know where to find me. The law's got a long memory, and the Daltons have made a lot of enemies. Anyone harboring one of their associates, well, that's a serious matter." "Of course, Marshall." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, but his eyes held hers a moment longer. "Good evening, Miss Mitchell. You sleep well now." Sarah closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering like a woodpecker against her ribs. When she turned, Jack stood in the kitchen doorway, his face pale as moonlight. "You lied for me," he said, wonder and fear warring in his voice. "Yes. Why?" Sarah looked at this boy who might be a killer, who certainly carried the mark of killers, who had brought danger to her quiet life like a match brought to dry grass. She thought about justice and mercy, about the law and love, about all the ways a person could be guilty and innocent at the same time. "Because," she said finally, "I've learned that brands don't always tell the whole story." Jack's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. Instead, he nodded once, sharp and decisive like a man making a vow. Outside, Marshall Brady's horse moved through the darkness toward the hotel, carrying questions Sarah couldn't answer and justice she wasn't sure she wanted to see done. And in her kitchen, lit by the warm glow of the oil lamp, a branded boy stood straighter, as if her lie had given him permission to hope again. But hope, Sarah knew, was a dangerous thing in a world where mercy and justice rarely shared the same bed. And she had the sinking feeling that her choice tonight had set events in motion that would demand a reckoning none of them were prepared to face. That night, as Sarah lay awake listening to the wind test her windows, she realized she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. She had chosen love over law, mercy over justice, and now all that remained was to discover what that choice would cost them both. The boy finally spoke the truth that had been choking him for weeks. And when the words came, they shattered everything Sarah thought she knew about guilt and innocence. The confrontation Sarah expected never came with gunfire or handcuffs. Instead, it arrived on a Tuesday morning wrapped in the sound of tears. She found Jack sitting on the back steps of the schoolhouse, his shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that came from a place deeper than grief, the kind that rose from a soul finally ready to break open and bleed truth onto the world. The November air was sharp with the promise of winter, and his breath came in small white clouds that dissipated like prayers into the gray sky. Sarah sat beside him without speaking, the way she'd learned to do when words were too heavy for the moment. She simply waited, her presence an invitation he could accept or refuse as his courage allowed. "I was never really one of them," he said finally, his voice raw as sandpaper against wood. "The Daltons, I mean. I was just a starving orphan they found stealing bread behind a saloon in Coffeyville." Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, but she didn't interrupt. Some stories demanded their own pace, their own rhythm of revelation. "My parents died in the cholera outbreak 2 years back. Left me with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and a hunger that felt like it was eating me from the inside." Jack wiped his nose with his sleeve, a gesture so young and vulnerable it made Sarah's heart ache. "I try to make on my own, but a 12-year-old boy don't have many options when he's got no family, no money, no nothing." The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the schoolyard like whispered secrets. Jack pulled his jacket tighter around his thin frame and continued. "Grat Dalton found me digging through garbage behind Murphy's saloon. I was so weak I could barely stand, and when he offered me a meal, I would have followed him to hell itself." His laugh was bitter as medicine. "Turns out, that's exactly where he was headed." Sarah reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm against his cold ones. The gesture seemed to give him strength, because his voice grew steadier. "They didn't make me a gang member. They made me property, branded me like a calf, told me I belonged to them now, that this mark meant nobody else would ever want me." He touched his left arm through the fabric of his shirt, said I was useful because I looked innocent, because lawmen wouldn't suspect a hungry child of being a lookout. "The bank robbery in Coffeyville," Sarah said quietly. "Were you there?" Jack nodded, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "They posted me on the corner with instructions to whistle if I saw law coming. But when the shooting started, when I heard those people screaming," he stopped, his breath hitching. "I ran. Just turned tail and ran like the coward I am." "That doesn't make you a coward, Jack. That makes you human. 2 people died that day because I didn't warn them. If I'd been braver, if I'd found a way to alert the marshal—" "You were a child," Sarah interrupted, her voice fierce with protectiveness. "A starving, branded child who'd been told he was property. The blood on those men's hands isn't yours to carry." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching clouds gather on the horizon like an army preparing for battle. Finally, Jack spoke again. "When I ran from Coffeyville, I kept running. Walked for weeks, sleeping in barns when I could find them, stealing what I needed to survive. By the time I got to Cedar Ridge, I was ready to die. Would have welcomed it, actually." He looked at her then, his eyes clear as winter sky. "Then you found me. Fed me. Didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like maybe I was worth something more than the brand on my arm." Sarah felt tears sliding down her own cheeks now. "Oh, child, you were always worth more than that. Always. Marshal Brady won't see it that way." "Marshal Brady isn't here," Sarah said firmly. "I sent him toward Tahlequah yesterday morning with a story about seeing a boy matching that description boarding a freight train." She smiled at Jack's surprised expression. "The first deliberate lie I've told since I was your age, and I don't regret it for a second. But what if he comes back? What if someone recognizes me?" Sarah stood and brushed the dust from her skirts, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on a pond. "Then we'll face that when it happens. But in the meantime, I have a proposition for you." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, legal documents she'd had drawn up in secret by the town's lawyer, pages that had cost her a month's salary, and every favor she could call in. "These are adoption papers, Jack. If you'll have me, I'd like to be your legal guardian. Give you my name, a permanent home, a future that isn't defined by what someone burned into your skin." Jack stared at the papers as if they might vanish if he looked away. "You do that?" even knowing what you know about me, especially knowing what I know about you. Sarah knelt in front of him, taking his face in her hands the way she'd done with her own son a lifetime ago. Brands can be prison bars or proof of survival, depending on who's reading them. I choose to see yours as evidence that you survived something that would have broken most grown men. That makes you stronger than any outlaw who ever drew breath. When Jack threw his arms around her neck and sobbed against her shoulder, Sarah felt something broken inside her begin to heal. The boy who had once been branded property was choosing to become her son, and she was choosing to believe that grace could grow in the most unlikely soil. Winter settled over Cedar Ridge like a forgiveness that year, blanketing the town in snow that made everything clean and new. The brand on Jack's arm remained. It always would, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it served as a reminder that love could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of compassion. Sarah Mitchell had lost one son to fever and found another in the dust behind her schoolhouse. And if that wasn't proof that God moved in mysterious ways, she didn't know what was. As Christmas approached, and Jack helped her string lights in the windows, Sarah realized that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as problems. Sometimes mercy looked like a lie told to a marshal. And sometimes grace took root in the space between what we deserve and what we're given, growing stronger in the darkness until it could finally stand in the light. Years later, when Jack became a teacher himself, he would tell his own students about the woman who saw past his scars to the person he could become. He would speak of brands and grace, of hunger and hope, and of how love could rewrite even the cruelest stories. But he would never forget the lesson Sarah taught him that winter in Cedar Ridge, that sometimes the deepest wounds become the sources of the greatest compassion, and that mercy, once planted, grows wild and strong enough to shelter anyone brave enough to seek its shade.